"You picked the wrong person to harass tonight." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She didn't explain. The words cut through the night like glass, calm, precise, impossible to ignore. Red and blue lights washed over the asphalt at the Westfield Heights checkpoint, turning rainwater into mirrors. Engines idled. Windows stayed rolled halfway down. Everyone watching knew this wasn't about safety. The banner overhead read, "Neighborhood Safety Initiative." But the officers knew the real mission. Find a reason, make a stop, create a number. And tonight, they thought they'd found an easy one. What they didn't know, what would change everything in the next few minutes, was that this woman wasn't afraid, because she already knew how this night would end. General Amelia Hargrove watched the officer at the cone, watched the way his jaw worked when the radar gun blinked nothing. She should have been home 3 counties away, going over briefs in the quiet house that matched her own pale, spare line of living. She had taken the late run because a meeting had been cut, because the route through Westfield was faster, and because, as a matter of habit, she never let minor inconvenience become a reason for argument. Her uniform had been hung for civilian wear, a dark overcoat, a pressed blouse, an old ribbon bar pinned absent-mindedly at her left breast. Even so, the soft silver of her hair and the milky clarity of her eyes set her apart in a place where most were ordinary, anonymous. "You need to roll your window down, ma'am," the officer called, voice officious and small in the big night. He smelled of stale coffee and the cheap cologne that hangs heavy in patrol cars. He never looked at the insignia at her collar. No one did on nights like this. The uniforms on the other side of the cones were only instruments of a different kind of order. Amelia rolled the window down. The officer leaned on the hood with one elbow, the badge shining like a shrug. "License and registration." She handed them over without hurry. She watched him take her papers, saw the flicker of recognition when he realized who she was. Recognition sharpened into irritation as he set them down and leaned in, too close. "We've had complaints about late-night traffic," he said. "Driver's been acting nervous. Step out of the vehicle." "I will not consent to a search," she said. She kept her voice flat, precise. Fourth Amendment, right to refuse. She calibrated each word with the same discipline she'd used to direct brigades. "You have no warrant, there's no probable cause." He laughed, sour and small. "You can stand off to the side, ma'am, for safety." "There is no safety issue," she replied. "You may proceed as you lawfully can, but you cannot search my vehicle without consent or a warrant." He straightened in a way that said the conversation was over, that legality was a formality that could be maneuvered.
2 other officers materialized from the cones, one young, eyes eager, one older, scarred on the knuckles. Captain Wilson arrived after them, not in a car, but in the loose authority of his stride. He wore his cap back and the confident, practiced expression of someone who had learned how to turn law into pressure. He had been running the Westfield program for 2 years. Under his watch, arrest numbers had climbed, and the council had smiled indulgently at the uptick. Quotas, they called them in hushed tones, and administrative necessity. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, ma'am," Wilson said. He did not bother with titles. "Step out." Amelia did not step out. She put her hands on the wheel, palms flat, and blinked once at the officer holding her documents. She kept her mouth soft but firm. "You're detaining me without cause," she said. "I'm asking you to let me go." Officer Harris, young, quick to mirror the captain, reached in and jerked the car door open. His hand brushed the sleeve of her overcoat. It was a touch with intent. He wanted to provoke, to establish an edge. Amelia did not move, her jaw set. The posted light above them hummed like a distant insect. From behind the ribbon of cones, the neighborhood slept, blinds drawn, faces turned inward. Westfield Heights had been a target for months, a mapped cluster of stops, a grid of traffic and pedestrian checks that always seemed to find those with little power to resist. "Step out," Harris said again, "now." She opened the door slowly, enough to keep the world orderly. The cold air hit her face, and the fluorescent made the pale of her hair almost white. Her palms were steady. She should have shown submission, the town's customs of compliance, to make it easier. Instead, she stepped out and stood squarely on her feet, a figure in the harsh light. The officers expected belligerence or tearful pleas. She offered neither. Harris moved like a man who had practiced the gesture in the mirror, fingers close to her wrists, then the click of metal. The cuff snapped. Amelia felt the bite of cold steel, and the quick, too familiar claustrophobia in her wrists. It turned the calm of the night into a personal ledger, each scrape a line. He tightened them deliberately, the sound crisp, an assertion. "You gonna talk now?" Harris said. He smiled in the way bullies do when they think they are funny.
Captain Wilson leaned in, the scent of his tobacco cheap and human. "We have to teach some people their place," he said low, the words meant to echo rather than to explain. There was a pressure in the chest that belonged not to fear but to indignation. Amelia kept her face neutral. She knew she had been cuffed without probable cause, in a calculated show of force. She knew the rules about searches, about evidence, about what officers could and could not do, and she had a lifetime of training in not letting a moment become a personal war.
Yet the metal at her elbows felt like something the law itself had turned against her. She let her hands flex. The cuffs bit but did not draw blood. She kept her breath even. The public camera on the light pole above, one of the overpriced fixtures the city had installed to justify the partnership, blinked dark. The officer noticed and shrugged, looking at his squad's dashcam, which had gone black a month ago under unexamined circumstances. "Battery's been low all night," he said. Another practiced excuse. "You have the right to remain silent," Harris intoned, as if reading from a script that ignored the constitutional problems before him. He read Miranda like a muscle movement, familiar, perfunctory. Amelia allowed the recitation to wash over her like an old song. It was not humiliation she felt. It was the thin, precise anger of someone who had watched institutions, law, military, civil society, bend around self-interest until their stated purpose was blurred. She'd seen it before in deployments, in briefings where words like collateral and tolerable loss were measured like budgets. She had also seen the other side, people who bent themselves around the rule of law to fix it back into place. On her wrist, concealed beneath the cuff, she pressed the side of her watch. A contactless protocol, a small thing reserved for emergencies and oversight. She had the authority to do it. As a retired four-star now serving in a civilian capacity as a liaison on certain defense projects and oversight boards, she had the channels. People in the local station thought she was merely a decorated stranger. They didn't know the phone numbers behind her face. Her thumb found the sensor, and a private channel opened, whisper quiet and direct. The call went to a liaison at the federal level, an FBI contact who maintains a relationship with Pentagon Investigative Services. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. The message was a single sentence. Unlawful detention at Westfield checkpoint. Immediate oversight requested. A protocol code flashed on the liaison screen. Hargrove alert. "You're doing this to yourself," Wilson said to her, leaning in close enough that his breath nicked the jet of rain on her cheek. Amelia let the watch cool back into being a watch. The message, once sent, could not be unsent. She did not flaunt her call. She did not brag. She knew how long it could take. She also knew something else. The men who did this kind of work loved to act like they have immunity from the system that employed them. They liked the illusion of power. They had forgotten that systems have chain of command, and that federal oversight answered to rules they could not easily twist. If this grabbed you, a quick like means you want more justice dramas. The officers hustled her toward the processing van like a procession that claimed normalcy.
Inside, the fluorescent made everything sharp and bland. There was a table bolted to the wall, a fan that sounded like a ceiling fan on a ship, and a camera that faced outward but offered angles that could be obscured with a well-placed hand. Harris flicked the switch. Nothing. "Battery's dead," he said, and laughed as if the laugh were an alibi. "You can call your higher-ups," he said, as he pushed forms toward her. "We have a duty to clear the complaint. Sign here that you refuse to consent to a search. Just a formality." The paper was lined with procedural language. It was a shape meant to look like consent while erasing coercion. Amelia read through the lines, parsing the legalese with the mechanical thoroughness of someone who'd spent years studying protocol. They were trying to create a paper trail that would justify what was an unjustifiable act. She refused to be yoked by their forms. "You're offering me a waiver under threat," she said. "That's not voluntary." Harris leaned in and put a pen at her hand. "Make it easier. Save us all the paperwork." "Sign it, and I will sign that you had probable cause to detain me," she said. The words were simple fairness. It was a challenge placed on the table. Produce lawful cause, or accept that law mattered. Someone banged on the outside shutter. A voice, crisp, measured, called from the dim. "Captain Wilson, this is the Westfield Municipal Prosecutor. We need an update." Wilson's expression for the first time showed a crack. He answered in the clipped tone of a man who needed to lie, and then fudge. "Processing a complaint," he said. "No problem." When the prosecutor's voice faded, Amelia watched the men trade looks. They were used to being able to shape narratives. They had learned to be clever with memory and paperwork. They forgot, in the press of practice, that certain people did not accept being written into convenient stories. Detective David Morales arrived without a badge that night. He never let his badge get in the way of the work. He wore a plain jacket and an old baseball cap pulled low, but the set of his shoulders was familiar to Amelia. They'd met before, in a conference room where he had given measured testimony about data irregularities. He moved like someone who had been kept at a remove,
reassigned from major cases, shifted to administrivia, told his experience was no longer needed. He slipped into the processing van with a folder under his arm. He closed the door behind him with a care that said caution rather than secrecy. In the belly of the van, amid the fluorescent hum, he offered a hand that was not for choking and set the folder gently on the table. "General Hargrove," he said, voice low. "You okay?" She nodded once. Her wrists were starting to ache. The cuffs had a way of making time into a visible thing. He had the tired, sober look of a man who had seen enough to keep him awake and not enough to make him safe. "You shouldn't have come through here."
It was not reproach so much as fact. They're concentrated. Quotas. Mayor's office? Well, councilman. He likes the numbers. Wilson likes to show he can produce. Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly. Councilman Bennett. Morales's nod carried a kind of heaviness. He had been the man in the precinct who remembered the old rules when the new ones were being bent. He had watched the logs be altered, forms carefully misfiled, complaints migrated to folders no one opened. They run stops like a funnel. Westfield gets the brunt because the numbers make good reports, arrests, citations, whatever. It keeps developers happy. It keeps people off the block. He laid out a small set of documents from the folder, a redacted complaint file, a printout of arrest statistics that had been surgically adjusted, an internal memo with a highlighted line about target demographics. He had photographs of checkpoint placement, time-stamped, clustered like a heat map that told a story of intent. The pages were the kind of evidence that whispered, and then, if read by the right ears, could roar. "They've been doing this for months," Morales said. "Complaints come in and disappear, cameras go offline, and when someone pushes back, they make an example." "You risked reassignment for this," she said. She had known, from the way his hands trembled when he refolded a page, that he had paid a price. He didn't deny it. "I was moved to domestic surveillance," he said. "I lost my unit. They told me it was administrative need. I filed internal complaints. They were handled." Handled meant buried. It also meant he had to be careful. He had brought what he could. Copies, memos, even a recording he'd captured from a station briefing, where a supervisor talked about numbers that would make the council happy. It was not much. A man alone could not do all required to topple a crooked system, but it was enough, perhaps, to turn a legalizing pattern into an admission. Outside, the night continued as if nothing had happened. A radio crackled with someone's joke. The cone lights kept their weary vigil. But inside the van, within the bubble of bleach-bright light, a different kind of counting was being done, minutes since the call. The line on the watch that showed the Hargrove alert had been received and locked, a small digital confirmation that said federal notification had occurred. "You called them," Morales said. He had been watching her. Of course he had. Whistleblowers learned to read minute gestures. She did not deny it. She had called in the way she had been trained to call. Spare, factual, without hectoring. Nothing theatrical. Just a transmission that placed the event within a jurisdictional frame that could not be shrugged away. She had not called to protect herself. She had called because she believed in redirecting the current of abuse from the neighborhood to a process that could interrogate it. "How long?" Morales asked. 43 minutes, she said.
If they respond as they've promised. The number was precise and anchored. It was not a magic bullet. It was a window. The prep was clinical. Get the forms, gather the evidence, document everything that could be documented before it was scrubbed. Morales moved with the awkward ferocity of someone clinging to the facts. He handed her a small black device, an evidence recorder, commercial but reliable, the kind used in internal affairs. He had wired the van, unseen, to capture a discrete feed. They would have audio of the processing, no matter how much the cameras blinked dark. Outside, Wilson's hands were a television of small motions, a phone pressed to his ear, short sentences exchanged like bullets. Councilman Bennett's name wrapped around the edges. Some calls were panic, and panic in their world meant erasures. He texted an aide, "Contain Hargrove. Don't let this get out." The aide typed back anxiously. Words like franchise and contracts appeared in the half-formed sentences on the screen, the tweets of political nervousness. That was the architecture. Enforcement used to make plans possible, plans that fed property deals and a stream of campaign donations. The checkpoint program had begun with talk of security and revitalization. Slowly, systems had been converted to a selection tool. Westfield's residents were an algorithmic result, flagged and curated by policies that looked benign on paper and dangerous in practice. Amelia looked at the documents Morales had taped and glanced at the recorder. She kept thinking in lists and contingencies. She did not let anger turn to spectacle. It would not do to be a martyr in a small town. It would do more good to be an incident in a chain of admissible evidence. "Get me the officer roster," she said,
and any logs for the checkpoint last 30 days. We'll need dashcam footage, maintenance requests for cameras, any internal memos about quotas or numbers. Morales nodded. He already had some of it, but the more the better. A case like this needed redundancy, copies, timestamps, an onion of corroboration. He told her quietly about a pattern he'd noticed. Equipment failure always coincided with increased stops. Complaints about excessive force either vanished or were marked as withdrawn. He had a spreadsheet, rows of numbers that meant little until they were shown for what they were, targeted enforcement. You understand the risk, she said. If I'm your source, then you're part of this chain. He smiled without humor. I understand. They worked like two surgeons in a small room, clipping evidence into a sterile tray. The clock on the van said 17 minutes since the alert. Across town, in the municipal building that had once promised light and progress, Captain Wilson's face grew closed. He had made phone calls that rang in a rhythm of panic. He tried to get his hands on the recording devices. He checked dashcams, pulled logs, toggled systems.
He could already see the narrative shifting. He could imagine the committee hearings, the subpoenas, the auditors with their slow, permanent way of making things true. As minutes ticked, the precinct began to move as if toward triage. The officers who had been blithe in their cruelty became slightly more careful. Smiles that had been sharp folded in a little. The mayor's office sent a terse message down formal lines: cooperate with federal authorities. The message implied a new leash. The men of Westfield Heights were not yet detained, but their latitude had narrowed. Amelia kept her dignity. Even cuffed, she was not a spectacle for their nerves. She answered questions directly and refused to be hurried into a narrative she did not own. She asked to speak to a supervisor who was not physically present that night, invoking the kind of careful lawyering a person living by rules acquires. She did not mention the outward things, that she was albino, that her skin had been an easy visual marker for attention, or that it had opened her to certain social assumptions over her life. That secret she bore like a worn photograph, present but not necessary for the task at hand. The watch gave another faint beep. The liaison had received the alert and logged it. A confirmation came through the secure number. Federal acknowledgement received. Response estimated within 43 minutes. Her throat loosened a fraction. It was an odd feeling. Hope in a procedural sense. Hope as a matter of logistics rather than sentiment. 40 minutes in, someone at the station opened a drawer. They found, where they hadn't expected to look, an old audio cassette, a trivial relic, but more than that, a small digital recorder wrapped in a clean napkin. Wilson thought to destroy it. He called for a supervisor to sanitize the van. But these men were creatures of habit and not of ingenuity. Cleaning was a ritual, and sometimes rituals failed. Before the napkin had been reached, Morales had slipped out, under the pretense of checking a camera, and came back with copies he had made earlier when he had the opportunity to be near the van while doing a routine paperwork run. Morales's copies were not just a roll of data. He had the courage of a man with a stake, and the cunning of someone who had to be 2 steps ahead. In the cramped van, he tapped a file on the recorder and played a half-minute of a briefing. In the recording, a supervisor's voice, flat, matter-of-fact, said, "We're going to need numbers this quarter. Make sure Westfield is producing. The council likes momentum." The phrasing was bland, but the tone turned the memorandum into motive. "That's actionable," Amelia said. She had the legal instincts of someone who had navigated military courts and civilian oversight panels. Tone could be as damning as explicit orders. If we corroborate that with logs and displacement data, it shows intent. That move, tying enforcement to development, could be the linchpin.
Morales flicked through pages. He had lists of fines, of arrests filed on the flimsiest of probable cause claims, loitering where there was no ordinance, open container violations in places where enforcement was selectively applied. He had names of residents whose records showed a pattern, legal consequences stitched into their livelihoods. He had a young man who had lost his job because of a citation, a mother whose car had been impounded after a stop that left no report. These were the ripples of the checkpoint program, the collateral tally. "Get legal counsel involved," Amelia said. "Contact the liaison's civil rights desk. Make sure the evidence chain is preserved. Don't let anything leave the van untouched." Morales's face, under the cheap cap, was tired and resolute. "I already re-downloaded what I could," he said. "I copied logs. I put them on a secure drive. But there's more to get. There are memos, internal emails, that won't be on the public servers. I can't access them from the inside without leaving a trace." "Then we make a trace that can be followed," she said. "A subpoena trail. We document who had access." Outside the van, the world continued to run its small, indifferent circuits. A man on the sidewalk pulled a paper from his pocket and lit a cigarette. 2 houses over, a child watched from behind curtains. In the municipal building, the aide to Councilman Bennett typed and deleted a message, uncertain how to instruct a man bent on protection and pretense. Bennett, for his part, paced, calling contractors, men whose roles had been aided by the perception of order.
Around them, policy and profit braided into a skein that began with the small, ordinary acts of checkpoints and ended, if unchecked, in something larger and more permanent. At 25 minutes past the call, an unmarked car pulled up across the street. It idled with its windows up. A man in a dark coat sat inside, review papers on his knee, his face a mask of focused attention. He was not in uniform. He did not need to be. The van's door opened, and a federal agent stepped into the rain-slick night with a laminated badge held casually in hand. He was not theatrical. He was only present. Inside the van, the small group watched him through half-lidded eyes. The agent's movements were efficient. He approached the processing van and flashed his credentials to Captain Wilson through the open hatch. Wilson's smile had that wet, urgent quality now, the kind you see in someone who believes they can still negotiate the terms of truth. "General Hargrove?" the agent asked, voice low. "Yes," Amelia said, the cuffed wrists echoing a quiet dignity. "We received a Hargrove alert," he said. "We're here to observe and to secure any potential evidence that falls under federal jurisdiction. We're here to ensure civil rights are protected." Wilson's face changed, layers of control folding into something narrower. He straightened his cap as if to adjust the optics.
Of course, he said, which read like a man who had been waiting his whole career to perform that phrase. There was still time, minutes in which the men in plain clothes could decide to scrub, to move, to reframe. The arrival of federal presence did not make actions retroactively lawful. It merely shrank the space in which lawless improvisation could take place. It tightened the screws on self-justification. Amelia thought of the people of Westfield Heights, of the nights their children had been singled out, of the way a neighborhood could be catalogued and unnerved. She thought of the way institutions that promised protection turned themselves into mechanisms of profit for a few. She felt again the weight of the cuffs, and then the quick, quiet warmth of the recorder pressed into her palm, evidence in a world that often preferred a comfortable narrative. Detective Morales, standing behind the agent, allowed himself a breath. The federal man's arrival did not guarantee a clean sweep of justice. It meant a new set of doors would open. Auditors, subpoenas, the slow mechanical generosity of due process. But it also meant that the home of the program, its paperwork, its memos, its quiet compliance, would now be scrutinized by people with means to bind those scattered pieces into legal ties. The agent asked for statements. Amelia began to speak. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. She told them what happened in the narrow, controlled way of someone trained not to let emotion obscure fact. She gave times, noted camera failures, mentioned the tightening of the cuffs. She produced the recorder Morales had given her. The agent accepted it with the same grave courtesy one gives a fragile thing. Captain Wilson watched as color drained from his face. He tried to keep his posture neutral, but the cameras of his station, the ones that remained functional, sat like a carousel of potential witnesses to his choices. For the first time, he became aware of the slow, weighty bureaucracy he had tried to elide. Auditors, federal overseers, internal investigators, subpoenas that arrived like tide. Inside the van, Amelia thought of what would come next. Interviews, a formal investigation, perhaps indictments if the evidence held. She thought also of the people whose convictions, fines, and records would be judged anew. She thought of the young man whose job had been taken because a stop had been logged in his record. She thought of the mother whose bank account had been drained by impound fees. Those were the ledger lines of harm. She had initiated a call with her wrist, a small mechanical truth, a watch pressed to a sensor, a liaison notified. The mechanics of oversight were practical, sometimes slow, often process-driven, but they could not be ignored. That was the point. She had not sought spectacle. She had sought accountability. The air tightened outside as more unmarked vehicles unrolled down the block, the hush of federal presence arriving like an edict. Men and women in plain coats moved with a calm that was not smug, but procedural. They marshaled their own methods, chain of custody bags, evidence forms, agents who made quiet calls. The arrival did not mean instant punishment. It meant an apparatus of investigation in motion. General Amelia Hargrove kept her composure. She had not come to be an emblem. She had come to be a node in a network of accountability. She had been cuffed for talking back, for refusing an unjust search. She had made a call. The call, a single, small thing that slid through classified channels, had signaled to others who could no longer look away. 42 minutes after she pressed her watch, a senior investigator from the federal liaison stepped up to the van and opened the hatch. His badge was quiet in the light. He looked at Amelia as if he could assess the weight of the night from the set of her jaw. He did not speak of careers yet. Careers were for later. He only said, "We will secure everything you've identified. We will preserve the scene. We'll need you to walk us through what you can recall, step by step." Amelia nodded. She was no longer merely a woman cuffed for the audacity of refusing a search. She was witness, complainant, and the first fragile instrument of a chain that might unmake years of cultivated impunity. She felt the wrists burn where metal had claimed them, and beneath the ache, a sense of a larger hand beginning to move. The door of the processing van swung shut slowly behind the agents as they moved into the rain. The night did not feel calmer. It felt, in one precise way, less inevitable. The actors in the story, Wilson, Bennett, Harris, had not yet been tried by justice. They were only beginning to be seen. The processes they had used like tools would now be examined as evidence. Amelia let out a breath she had held for the span of a thin strip of time. She had made a call and set a mechanism in motion. She had not sought fame or vengeance. She had sought adherence to the Constitution and a protection the neighborhood deserved. In the van's light, with rain on the window, with the federal agents speaking quietly into a recorder, she felt something shift. The ordinary arithmetic of power had been complicated by a single act. Outside, the city's lights blurred in the rain. Inside, Detective Morales closed the folder and looked up at her with a muted, tired hope. "You did the right thing," he said. She considered him for a long moment. The right thing was often a matter of stubbornness in the face of convenient untruth. It was the lawful thing, she corrected. In the long run, law mattered more than righteousness. Law could remake the ledger. At the edge of the street, Councilman Bennett watched the parade of federal cars with a hand over his mouth.
Now he was watching a machine he had kept at arm's length begin to whir back to life. Inside the van, the recorder captured the low sound of the rain and Amelia's measured account. The federal agents cataloged the forms. Morales moved between them and the station computer, its screen a soft, anonymous glow. Beyond the scope of the van, Westfield Heights slept in the way cities do. Some lives wrapped in light, and some lives wrapped in thin, necessary hope. 43 minutes since the alert, a federal supervisor stepped out of an SUV and closed the door with the calm finality of someone used to arriving precisely when things could no longer be ignored. He flicked the tiny light on the recorder and said once, "We're taking custody of the evidence." The men who had tightened cuffs like tools felt, for a moment, the thin tremor of their own exposure. They had made choices in the dim that had seemed small. Now they learned those choices could become the basis for a public accounting. Careers are not felled by a single night. They are dismantled by a methodical, patient process. This process had only just started. Amelia watched the federal supervisor's hands, the slow mechanics of paperwork, felt the press of the cuffs, and knew that whatever came next would move through offices and courtrooms and committee rooms, where the arithmetic of justice was less immediate, but in time more binding. She had put her dignity against a small act of abuse and set in motion a chain that could not be rewound. The van's door clicked shut, and the rain kept its patient patter on the metal roof. Beyond it, the neighborhood would still wake in the morning with the same cracked sidewalks, the same small shops, the same people who had learned to make life under the checkpoint. But now the story had an official voice, a federal presence, a recorded account, and a trail that led directly to men who had used enforcement as a ledger for other gains. As the agents stepped back into the night with evidence bags and quiet, Amelia allowed herself the smallest of satisfactions. She had been cuffed for talking back. She had made one call. The call had stretched outward like a wire, and quietly begun to hum. They were not finished. They were only at the beginning of a long, careful work. She tightened her fingers where the metal bit, and already began to prepare herself for the interviews to come. Her statements, the subpoenas, the slow legal calculus that would demand patience more than triumph. But for the first time that night, the hum under her skin was not of fear. It was a cautious, measured confidence, a sense that processes existed to bind wrongs into record, and records, if persistent and precise, could make institutions answer. The federal supervisor closed the van's hatch with a practiced hand, and the night's small machinery shifted into something larger and slower. Paper trails, subpoenas, forensics.
General Amelia Hargrove stepped out into the rain with the cuffs finally loose around her wrists, the bite of the metal still an ache under her skin. An agent handed her a cup of water and an offer of a blanket. She accepted both without theatrics. The immediate danger had passed, but the work was only beginning. In the days that followed, Westfield Heights, its cracked stoops, its late-night diners, the strip of donated lights that now looked less like charity and more like a surveillance grid, felt the first rasp of public attention. Federal agents fanned out into the municipal building and the precinct with orders and warrants. The word subpoena moved through the offices like an audible ledger. Emails from municipal accounts, maintenance logs for cameras, the dashcam servers once thought beyond scrutiny. The processing band's recorder became Exhibit A, the small device whose quiet mic had captured a supervisor's bland directive about showing numbers. Captain Wilson, who had practiced the posture of command for years, found his offices filed, his drawers opened, his calendars cataloged. He moved in a haze of calls that went unanswered at the council office, of aides who suddenly could not be reached. He sat across from an internal affairs investigator whose calm voice read him what happened next: administrative leave pending investigation. The words had the mechanical finality of paperwork. They also carried stakes. For a man whose career had been aligned to producing metrics, the loss of station was a first kind of defeat. Officer Harris was similarly taken aside. The precinct had already put him on restricted duty the morning after the van's seizure. The department's director made it formal 2 days later. The patrolman had been removed from street duties, then suspended. When he later received notice of an indictment for deprivation of rights under the color of law, criminal charges often used when an officer's actions willfully violate constitutional protections, he stared at the envelope as if it were a foreign script. He had trained for confrontations. He had not trained for the slow, categorical unmaking of a career. Councilman Edward Bennett reacted differently. The man whose career had been built on coalition dinners and real estate room favors paced behind closed doors and called contractors with a voice that tried to be both calm and commanding. The federal inquiry widened like a circle. Bank records subpoenaed by federal prosecutors showed a series of contributions, expedited zoning decisions, and consulting contracts that correlated disturbingly with the placement of checkpoint clusters. Developers who once smiled at Bennett in public now answered questions with attorneys by their side. Detective David Morales felt the visible relief of the van's federal presence as well, but relief was not safety.
He had already been punished, reassigned, marginalized, told his judgment was no longer needed by local leadership, angry at his insistence on following irregularities. He had watched complaint files go cold and cameras go dark. Becoming a cooperating witness meant risking the last shreds of a law enforcement career that had been tenuous since his demotion. If exposure meant his reinstatement, it might also mean retaliation from colleagues who felt betrayed. He allowed himself one private, exhausted smile when the agent told him there would be counsel for witnesses and a temporary protective status for those who cooperated. He had brought the pieces. Now he would have the resources to stitch them together. Still, he did not lose the habit of watching the room. That was the price of conscience in an institution: constant vigilance. For weeks, federal analysts and Pentagon investigative liaisons worked in tandem. Colonel Jackson, sent from a military oversight desk to advise the coordination with defense-related contractors and to monitor the chain of command implications, arrived with a presence that was both civil and exacting. He did not carry a badge so much as a ledger of questions. He asked about contacts between local officials and developers who had interests adjacent to military projects, about procurement that might have overlapped with municipal safety programs, about whether checkpoints had been positioned in ways that coincided with land value gains. The evidence matrix that investigators assembled was methodical and, layer by layer, damning. Dashcam footage, when recovered from backup servers, showed stops that matched the heat maps Detective Morales had drawn, clusters of checkpoints along blocks associated with lower-income housing and older minority-owned businesses. Maintenance locks, once pulled from the municipal vendor, revealed a pattern in which cameras reported technical issues during the busiest nights of enforcement and were ostensibly repaired hours after police calls were made to the station's public safety line. Internal emails, once hidden on private threads, surfaced, with withdrawn messages and auto-deleted drafts that had been stored in shadow copies. One memo, innocuous in tone, recommended targeted operations in neighborhoods with high turnover and asked for metrics that could be repackaged as civic accomplishments. Audio evidence was particularly persuasive. The van's recorder, digital backups of station briefings, and a privately captured clip of a mid-level supervisor speaking at a briefing all became audible proof that the program's intent had shifted from public safety to a numerically driven political advantage. In one clip, a voice, flat and matter-of-fact, said, "Westfield is performing. Keep it that way. The council wants to show movement." The notion that enforcement could be a currency exchanged for political favor moved from speculation to demonstration.
Investigators looped in the federal civil rights prosecutors who specialized in pattern or practice cases, civil rights violations not as single aberrations but as deliberate systems. Those units did not promise quick fixes. They promised process, grand juries, subpoenas, depositions, the slow mechanical work of turning records into indictments. For the residents of Westfield Heights, the process was both a hope and an unsure thing. It could vindicate them, but vindication did not erase nights of embarrassment, financial loss, or the time their names had been dragged into an arrest ledger. Public attention grew when a local journalist broke a story after reviewing a sealed affidavit. The piece, anchored to the processing van's audio and the heat map, told of targeted checkpoints, of body cams turning off at pivotal moments, of a municipal program that had been reframed as neighborhood safety while serving a different purpose. The community's reaction was a strange mix of relief, validation, and reawakened anger. Town hall meetings filled to capacity. Families who had once accepted small humiliations at checkpoints came forward with accounts of jobs lost or fines that had cost savings and opportunities. As allegations moved into formal proceedings, Captain Wilson and Officer Harris learned the particulars of what federal indictments meant. They found their names in court filings that alleged deprivation of rights and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The charges included falsifying incident reports and tampering with evidence, serious allegations that, if proven, would end careers and invite criminal penalties. Wilson tried to defend himself in interviews with a combative stance at first, but institutional isolation is a corrosive thing. He began to see previously loyal aides step away. The council's leadership announced an ethics review and stripped him of certain committee duties pending investigation. The optics were swift and damaging. Councilman Bennett, facing a different kind of exposure, resigned from his committee posts when multiple contractors voluntarily cooperated with subpoenas, revealing an array of preferential zoning decisions and consulting payments tied to municipal initiatives. His resignation did not amount to admission, but it did remove the kind of political cover he had once enjoyed. Morales' cooperation proved decisive. He testified before a grand jury, where he laid out how complaints were rerouted, how cameras were conveniently out, and how the statistical outputs were curated. The indignity he had suffered garnered sympathy from jurors. His documentation, screenshots, printed logs, copies of redacted complaints, made an argument that could no longer be argued away as anecdote. He recounted, quietly and with the weary dignity of a man who had been punished for truth-telling, the consequences of exposure, reassignment, ostracism, threats of unspecified disciplinary action.
He faced cross-examination from defense counsel who tried to paint him as a disgruntled officer with a grudge. He acknowledged his frustration, but stood by the documents. Facts, he said, are stubborn. Indictments followed. A federal grand jury returned charges against Captain Wilson, Officer Harris, and a handful of others implicated in the chain of checkpoint enforcement. Councilman Bennett was indicted on counts related to conspiracy and influence peddling, allegations that he leveraged official power to benefit private interests tied to the checkpoint program. Unnests were carried out in the quiet hours, agents mindful of the optics but determined to secure the individuals implicated. It was not instantaneous justice. It was the piercing moment when a system that had seemed impermeable began to show seams. In court, the prosecution built its case by letting the evidence speak in layered form. A prosecutor played the van recording for the jury and then projected heat maps that matched stop locations with properties that had been rezoned, auctioned, or developed after months of intensified enforcement. Emails tied officials to developers whose contributions spiked in the same windows. The narrative the government told was not of a lone bad apple, but of a concerted mechanism that converted enforcement into profit and political capital. Defense teams tried to reframe the narrative around public safety, arguing that checkpoint placement had been a legitimate exercise in resource allocation, a response to calls for a safer town. The prosecution answered with the missing logs, the audio clips where numbers were prioritized, and the account of people like Amelia, an albino woman, a retired four-star general whose mere presence had been used as spectacle, who had been detained without cause. The contrast was sharp, a woman who had worn honor and service, and who had, in a single quiet act of oversight, pulled a thread that revealed a broader pattern. Months stretched as discovery continued, but within the community the effects were immediate. The municipal government implemented an emergency moratorium on checkpoint operations. An independent oversight committee was formed, populated with residents, legal experts, and representatives from a federal civil rights office. The sheriff's department announced new policies for body-worn cameras, strict mandate the cameras must remain powered and recording during any citizen interaction, with tamper logs and mandatory reporting for any technical failure. The city promised transparency dashboards, public access to stop statistics, camera maintenance schedules, and complaint logs updated in near real time.
These were not panaceas, but they were steps that turned secrecy into visibility. A turning point came with a televised hearing convened by a congressional committee looking into municipal policing practices and the misuse of enforcement for political gain.
The hearing, noisy, formal, inevitable, was the stage where evidence first met public accountability at the highest level. Amelia testified before the committee with the same measured clarity she had shown in the van. She narrated the facts: the stop at Westfield Heights, the cuffs that had been tightened without probable cause, the cameras going dark, the brief exchange in which a supervisor had spoken plainly about numbers. She presented the van's recording and the heat maps and told plainly why the Constitution mattered more than optics or political calculus. Congress members asked pointed questions. Some were procedural, concerned with jurisdictional controls and oversight mechanisms. Others were moral, about the dignity of people and the corrosive effect of seeing enforcement as an economic lever. Amelia answered each with a brevity that commanded attention. She emphasized the chain of custody protocols, the necessity for body cam policies that cannot be locally circumvented, and the importance of whistleblower protections for law enforcement personnel like Detective Morales. Her testimony carried weight because it was neither theatrical nor vindictive. She framed her actions as an adherence to duty, not to herself, but to the Constitution and to the residents of Westfield Heights. She spoke of dignity, how a community could be degraded, how records could steal opportunities, how people could be quietly priced out by fees and fines. She did not claim to be above the law. She insisted that the law must be above distortion. The committee's hearing produced recommendations: national guidance for checkpoint operations, stronger standards for public reporting of policing data, mandated audits for any municipal programs tied to developers, and enhanced protections for whistleblowers in law enforcement. It was, in legislative terms, a map rather than a decree. It created frameworks and suggested funding. Real reform, she and others agreed in private, would be local, dogged, and long-term. In the courtroom, the prosecution's mosaic of evidence carried different weights. Some defendants agreed to plea deals. Officer Harris took a plea that acknowledged his role in an unlawful detention and falsifying reports. He accepted responsibility in open court, an admission that carried a sentence and a lasting professional ban. Captain Wilson fought longer. His trial became a study in how authority corrodes. He argued in a defense shaped to cast decisions as discretionary judgment calls in favor of public safety. The jury, after hearing audio tapes, cross-examination, and the testimony of residents whose lives had been altered by ticketing and impounds, returned a verdict that found elements of the charges proven beyond a reasonable doubt. He was convicted on several counts related to deprivation of rights and falsifying records. The jury did not convict on every count, but the convictions were consequential: disciplinary termination from the department, loss of pension rights tied to his tenure, and legal penalties that marked the end of the policing career he had built. Councilman Bennett, confronted with a weight of documentary evidence linking his actions to contractors and zoning decisions, pled guilty to conspiracy charges in a deal that required full cooperation with investigators. He resigned his office and agreed to testify about the network of municipal favors and how they were woven into the checkpoint strategy. His political career ended not in a noisy scandal, but in a thin legal silence, a plea, a resignation, the slow retraction of influence. The ripple effects of the prosecutions were where the restorative work truly began. Federal prosecutors opened reviews of cases tied to the checkpoint program. Convictions and fines arising from stops that had been shown to be tainted by the program's intent were revisited. A review board audited hundreds of arrest records from the months when Westfield's checkpoints had been busiest. For many residents, this meant a long administrative process: petitions filed, hearings scheduled, paperwork assembled. For some, it meant relief when records were cleared or fines rescinded. For others, it meant testimony in front of the same institutions that had once kept them anonymous. At a community hearing, a young father named Marcus stood before a room full of residents and officials, voice steady yet fraught with the weight of months. A citation had cost him his job, and a subsequent eviction had pushed his family into a shelter for a time. He described the humiliation of being stopped in front of his child, and the way that encounter, documented in a log that later proved suspect, had rippled outward into access and opportunity. The board listened. In time, his record was expunged, his impound fees were refunded, and a small municipal fund was established to assist residents who could prove harms tied to the checkpoint program. The money could not fully repair months of lost income, but it could bridge a gap and acknowledge responsibility. Detective Morales was reinstated and in time placed in an internal affairs oversight unit tasked with tracking compliance with the new transparency rules. That was an irony not lost on him. The man who had been ostracized for insisting on documentation now had a formal role ensuring documentation. He accepted the role with a caution born of his history.
He also mentored younger officers, teaching them how to file complaints, how to preserve chain of custody, and how to be courageous in institutional cultures resistant to change. He received an official commendation for his role as a cooperating witness, formal recognition that felt modest to him and monumental to the families who had seen his records. Amelia kept working, not in the courtroom, but in policy rooms and community centers.
She testified in a series of panels advising how federal oversight could be better coordinated with local governance to prevent the weaponization of enforcement. She advocated for a simple, enforceable standard: no citizen encounter without a functioning camera, mandatory real-time upload of stop data, a public reporting dashboard, and civilian representation on oversight boards. She pushed not for punitive snap judgments, but for durable, structural transparency. The Pentagon liaison, Colonel Jackson, worked with municipal leaders to create a memorandum of understanding that restricted the use of federal contracting or procurement influence in local security programs. It addressed conflicts of interest and placed safeguards around municipal-private partnerships that had once been managed in shadowed rooms. It was not a law, but a binding contract that set expectations and created penalties for violations. In one workshop, he sat quietly as a group of residents asked detailed questions about oversight and funding. He listened and, when asked for practical steps families could expect, offered clear grids and timelines. Months after the initial call, Westfield Heights looked subtly different. Cameras were no longer ornaments to be turned off, their maintenance logs were public, and community volunteers sat on oversight panels asking hard questions. A small scholarship fund, seeded by a mix of municipal restitution, private donations, and a foundation set up to support communities affected by over-policing, funded summer programs and legal clinics. A storefront that had once been boarded up received a grant for a community health clinic. These were small, deliberate reparations that did not erase harm, but signaled commitment. Amelia attended one town hall months later, unadorned by rank, but carrying the quiet bearing of someone who had known both command and indignity. She listened as residents told her what had changed and what still needed to change. She spoke briefly, reminding the room that accountability was a long road and that institutions required constant oversight. She emphasized the need for gratitude towards those who stepped forward, like Morales, and towards residents who had refused to be shrugged aside. Her words were not grand, they were precise and actionable. At the congressional following, new federal guidance was issued, standards for checkpoint operations that required statistical transparency, mandatory external audits of program outcomes, and tighter restrictions on municipal-private contracts tied to the enforcement metrics. The guidance included language that required any jurisdiction using checkpoint-like operations to publish stop data, to maintain open maintenance logs for recording equipment, to institute immediate internal notification to federal civil rights offices if a high-ranking official activated an oversight alert, and to guarantee that whistleblowers in law enforcement would be shielded during investigations. In the end, careers were altered, legal reckonings held, and systems were adjusted. Some men faced criminal sentences and lost pensions. Some officials resigned and faded from public influence. For Westfield residents, the victories were both legal and civic. Many had records expunged, fines refunded, and opportunities to participate in a newly formed oversight body. For Amelia, the resolution was not triumphalism, but a reaffirmation of duty. She had used the limited channels available to her, a small, contactless watch, a liaison, a civil oath, and had turned a single unjust arrest into an impetus for systemic review. There were losses and complexities. Not every wrong could be fully repaired. Not every family recovered the months they had lost or the small privileges stripped by citations. The legal process had taken time, and time is itself a harm. Amelia recognized that the work of repair required ongoing commitment. She continued to meet with community leaders, with prosecutors, and with officials tasked with implementing the new guidelines. She mentored new oversight liaisons and helped design training modules that emphasized constitutional protections alongside policing techniques. Detective Morales, in quieter moments, sat across from a table at a coffee shop and spoke with a young recruit about the ethics of evidence. He told the recruit about the van recorder and the tightness of the cuffs, about the small mechanical things, like a sensor on a watch, that can make accountability possible. He did not offer platitudes. He spoke about habits, documenting everything, refusing to normalize irregularities, and protecting the dignity of those who are often overlooked. Those were practical lessons for a new generation of officers. Amelia, in the quiet of a late afternoon in her modest home, looked at the scar on her wrist where the cuffs had once bitten. It was faint, a memory in the skin.
She thought of the message she had sent with a single motion of her hand, of the Hargrove alert code that had flashed in a liaison's console, of 43 minutes counted on a watch that had become in that night a small instrument of justice. She did not think of vengeance, she thought of accountability, the slow and necessary architecture that turned particular injustice into institutional change. Months after the indictments, in a ceremony at the community center, records were officially cleared for a group of residents who had been disproportionately impacted. A woman named Lillian, a longtime resident who had once used all her savings to pay impound fees after a stop that had shown no probable cause, came up to Amelia with tears and clasped her hands. She thanked her for the work, but the thanks felt incomplete. Amelia, used to the language of duty, deflected. "We did what we could," she said. "This is what the law is supposed to look like when it works."
As part of the reparative measures, the city established an annual review panel that included citizen representatives and demanded periodic reporting to a federal oversight office. Developers who had benefited from the old arrangements were required to disclose past contracts and to undergo compliance reviews for future projects in Westfield Heights. The checks were not perfect, but they added layers of accountability where there had been too few. In quieter moments, the town's rhythm returned. The corner diner reopened a booth that had been boarded up. Children played under the same donated lights that now had maintenance tags and public logs, and neighbors who had once feared being flagged at checkpoints walked with a steadier gait. The memory lingered. Trauma does not simply dissolve, but community agency had been restored in measure. People organized neighborhood watches that were community-led, prioritizing restorative safety rather than punitive enforcement. Amelia accepted an invitation to speak at a symposium on police accountability and constitutional protections. She spoke as a witness and as a practitioner of civic duty. She spoke about the dangers when enforcement is measured by numbers instead of outcomes that matter to people. Jobs kept, houses remained, dignity preserved. She explained, plainly, how data could be used for good or weaponized for profit. She advocated for transparency as the best prophylactic to corruption. At the end of her speech, a young woman in the audience stood to ask a question. She spoke of fear she'd felt about being different, about being albino in a town where attention could be both unwanted and invasive. The question was personal and precise. Did Amelia regret exposing herself to scrutiny? Amelia's answer was immediate and measured. She said she did not think of identity as currency for attention. She had been cuffed because the men in power felt it would bolster their narrative. She said the point had never been about her visibility, but about the invisible ledger of policy that had cost people their livelihoods and peace. "Speak up when you can," she told the young woman, "and when you cannot, help those who can." The title of a news piece that ran days later captured the arc in blunt terms. One illegal cuff, one call, careers ended. It was a tidy headline, but the reality was more complicated and necessary. Careers ended because a careful, patient process of evidence gathering and accountability ran its course. A town's policies were re-examined, people's records were cleared, oversight systems were put in place. Justice here had been procedural, messy, deliberate, and sometimes slow. On a spring morning, Amelia stood at the edge of a community garden that had been seeded with restitution funds, watching volunteers plant perennials that would take seasons to bloom. Detective Morales came by with a thermos and a tired grin. He planted a small tree in memory of the month that had changed his life. They did not stage a ceremony. They did not need to. The garden was modest, a patchwork of effort and hope, but it was visible and belonged to those who tended it. She felt the wind on her face and thought of the night under the buzzing lights, of the metal that had bitten and the cold that had flaked into rain. She thought of the smallest acts that sometimes matter most: a watch pressed to a sensor, a recorded word, a file saved and duplicated, the courage of one detective, the unavoidable paperwork that binds people to truth. The institutional machinery that had once seemed to protect a few had been pushed towards transparency. Her phone buzzed. It was Colonel Jackson with an update on the standards committee he chaired. There were more meetings. The work was not finished. She smiled and told him she would be there. Then she looked at the garden and at the people moving among the beds, and she felt the modest but firm satisfaction of a job that had not been easy and had not been clean, but had, at least, bent towards accountability. At the edge of the garden, a small, hand-painted sign read, "Westfield Rebuilds." It was the sort of language that could be idealized, but it was also true. A community was taking practical steps to repair the harms that had once been imposed under the rubric of safety. Records were expunged, oversight boards met, policies were rewritten, and the men who had chosen to weaponize enforcement found themselves enmeshed in the legal and administrative results of their choices, stripped of badge, office, or committee seat. In the end, the simple arc of the night remained a small lesson in civic responsibility.
One illegal cuff had not been only about power over a single woman. It became a node in a much larger story about how systems can be redirected by those who insist on evidence and process. The Hargrove alert was not a talisman, but a mechanism, a channel by which oversight could be summoned when local systems failed their people. Detective Morales walked over and handed Amelia a small plastic cup of coffee. They stood in companionable silence, listening to the city breathe around them. She took another look at the hand-painted sign and softly said, "We did what we could." He nodded. "You called the right line," he said. "It made a difference." She smiled, not with triumph, but with the restrained relief of someone who had done her duty. One call does not fix everything, but it starts a process. They watched the first shoots of green push through the soil. The work would continue, and so would the checks and balances that would be needed to keep the system honest. But on that morning, in that small patch of community tending, Westfield Heights felt in a practical way repaired. If this story spoke to you, consider subscribing for more in-depth justice dramas. Every story is another moment of accountability.